Across Europe, scattered between quiet forests and orderly modern streets, stand the remains of structures once meant to outlive every nation, every sea, in Tory, every doubt. They were not built for worship. They were not built for the people. They were built to immortalize a single man, his power, his myth, his hunger to be carved into the spine of history. Today, those same structures crumble like abandoned promises, their stones carrying a weight that beauty alone cannot redeem. In his final years, Albert Speer walked through life like a man haunted by a past he could not outrun. Neighbors in Heidelberg recalled how he moved, ed quietly, politely, but with a distant invisible curtain between himself and the world. He avoided the spotlight with almost ritual discipline, as though every question about his past risked reopening a door he once helped fortify. Yet the past lingered. It lived in the massive avenues he once designed, in the triumphal arches and marching grounds of Nuremberg, in the skeletal remains of stadiums built to turn human beings into cinematic crowds. These were not simply architectural works. They were instruments of culture, propaganda, and control, stone amplifiers for a regime that understood how to weaponize spectacle. When Speer visited the ruins of his own creations, witnesses said he often stood motionless, studying the fallen columns as if reading a confession. Only he could decipher. The silence between him and those broken walls revealed a truth he seldom admitted. Architecture can serve as a mirror, and some mirrors expose more than the man wishes to see. And so our story begins not with Speer's ambition, nor with his rise, but with this quiet, uneasy aftermath. A man facing the wreckage of the world he helped build. From here, we will trace backward to the young architect searching for a purpose, to the moment he found the most dangerous client in history, and forward to the ruins that still challenge us to ask what beauty owes to morality. When we last saw Albert Speer, he was standing before the ruins of his own past, architecture stripped of purpose, ideals reduced to dust, and silence hanging heavy between a man and the monuments he once believed would outlive him. But to understand that silence, we must go backward, because the quiet old man who avoided questions in his final decades had once shaped the physical language of a dictatorship. His life is not merely a biography, it is a cautionary tale in stone. In post-war Germany, Speer lived like a ghost who refused to haunt. He kept his voice soft, his presence unobtrusive, as though afraid any loud gesture might betray the power he once wielded. Neighbors described him as courteous, even gentle, a man who held the door for strangers and never raised his voice. But behind that civility is an instinct to pull away whenever conversation drifted toward the past. It is a distinctly human reaction. When guilt grows too heavy to carry, people often try to fold themselves into smaller, quieter versions of who they once were. Speer did exactly that. Yet history, especially American historical memory, does not permit easy transformation. In the United States, the post-war decades became a time of reflection. Documentaries, courtroom transcripts, and survivor testimonies showed not only how Americans saw the war, but how they understood responsibility itself. Figures like Speer were examined not only for what they did, but for what they allowed, tolerated, rationalized. Speer understood that spotlight, and he moved deliberately to avoid it. When journalists came knocking, he answered with the restraint of a man walking across thin ice. His interviews were minimalist, carefully measured phrases, clipped sentences, a perpetual air of "I have already said too much." To many Americans consuming these interviews from afar, he appeared almost repentant, but to historians, his self-presentation raised uncomfortable questions. Was this remorse or performance? A man confronting guilt, or a man curating legacy? Speer often walked the banks of the Neckar River in the early mornings, when the mist still hovered low and the world was quiet enough to feel forgiving. Locals would later remember him stopping on the bridge, staring across the water for long stretches of time. Was he remembering the applause of crowds, the scale of his creations, or the millions unseen in those grand designs people erased, displaced, or forced into labor so his buildings could rise? In American documentary tradition, this is where the narration slows, allowing the audience to inhale the weight of the moment, because every past has layers, and Speer's layers begin long before the war. His silence in old age was not born suddenly. It was the echo of choices made decades earlier, choices shaped by ambition, by culture, by the seductive pull of belonging to something larger than oneself, a temptation that transcends nations and eras. And so, as Speer aged, he became both participant and witness to his own contradictions. He published memoirs, yet withheld truths. He admitted guilt in general terms, yet dodged specifics. He condemned the regime, yet distanced himself from its darkest machinery. America, with its tradition of courtroom drama and moral clarity, struggled to categorize him. Was he the good Nazi he claimed to be? A tragic figure seduced by power? Or simply a man skilled at storytelling, using remorse as architecture for a new, more palatable self? Speer's life in the decades after the war became a kind of second construction project, not of stone, but of narrative, a quieter structure, a safer one, a version of events, where he appeared as a technician swept up in history's tide rather than a willing architect of spectacle. But every structure, whether made of granite or memory, reveals cracks under pressure, and to understand the man fully, we cannot remain in his old age. We must return to the beginning, to the young architect who believed he needed only one good client to define his future, and found the most dangerous client in modern history. We left Albert Speer standing at the threshold of his own contradictions, an old man shaping a quieter self, hoping the world would accept his late-in-life humility as truth. But silence in old age doesn't appear from nowhere. It grows from choices made when ambition is young, when dreams are sharper than conscience, and when the world aims to open its doors to the bold. To understand the architect Speer became, we must return to a time before guilt, before ruins, before his name carried the weight of history. We must meet him as he once was, a young man searching for a client who would make him matter. In the early 1920s, Germany was a nation in freefall. Inflation spun out of control, currencies became almost meaningless, and the cultural center of Europe felt itself drifting toward uncertainty. Yet in the midst of this instability grew a generation of young professionals who believed fiercely that architecture could reshape a wounded society. Albert Speer was one of them. He was not a prodigy, not a genius, not a radical innovator. What he possessed instead was something far more common, far more the hunger to be chosen, to design something that mattered. To rise above the anonymity that swallowed so many young men of his era. In American storytelling, this is the familiar beginning of a character arc, the bright, eager young professional standing at destiny's doorway. But in Speer's case, the door he chose would lead him into the darkest corridor of the 20th century. Speer admired the clean, severe lines of classical architecture. He believed buildings should command respect, should discipline the eye, should impose order on a world that felt increasingly chaotic. These beliefs were not unusual. American architects in the same era flirted with similar ideals, designing courthouses and federal buildings meant to project stability after periods of change. But where Americans used grandeur to reinforce democracy, Speer would eventually use it to reinforce something else entirely. As a young lecturer in Berlin, he struggled to stand out. Students described him as polite, earnest, and almost shy. He was talented, but not exceptional. In his own journals, he confessed to feeling invisible, a man waiting for the world to realize he existed. It was this emotional vulnerability, the desire to be recognized, that made him susceptible to the orbit of charismatic power. And then, one evening in 1930, Speer attended a political rally. He did not go for ideology. He went because a colleague told him the event was spectacular, that the speaker used light, space, and sound in ways a modern architect should study. That speaker was Adolf Hitler. This is where history tightens its grip. American historians often point to this moment as the hinge on which Speer's fate turned, not because Hitler's words seduced him, politica, lie, but because the production of the event seduced him, artistically, the torches, the marching rhythms, the way the crowd seemed to move as one living organism. It was theatre on a national scale, and SP, ear sitting in the back, unnoticed, felt a surge he had never felt in the quiet halls of academia. In that instant, the young architect saw something intoxicating, a client who understood the power of spectacle, a man who wanted architecture not just as shelter or beauty, but as performance, as propaganda, as stagecraft for political myth. Speer would later claim he had no political ambitions, no ideological conviction, no personal loyalty. What he wanted, what he truly wanted, was the chance to build. And Hitler, sensing Speer's talent and hunger, offered him exactly that. It was a meeting of two ambitions, one political, one artistic, each reinforcing the other in a feedback loop that would reshape Germany's physical and moral landscape. And so the young architect stepped forward, unaware that he was crossing the threshold into history's most dangerous commission. Because when a leader seeks monuments instead of policies, when he wants stone instead of dialogue, when he dreams of avenues that stretch further than the truth, an architect becomes something more than an artist. He becomes a collaborator in myth-making, and this is where Speer's ascent truly begins. He wasn't yet the architect of a regime, only a man dazzled by scale, seduced by spectacle, drawn toward a client who seemed to command the very elements Speer admired: light, rhythm, order, awe. And once a young architect tastes the possibility of building something monumental, it becomes almost impossible to return to small dreams. Now, Speer's real ascent begins, the moment ambition meets a monster willing to fund it. Hitler did not choose Speer because he was the best architect in Germany. He chose him because Speer understood, instinctively, the emotional language of architecture, the way stone, height, and symmetry could shape human feeling. To Hitler, this was more valuable than brilliance. He wanted devotion, not debate, aesthetic obedience, not architectural innovation. From an American historical perspective, this pairing mirrors a familiar theme. When power seeks legitimacy, it turns to imagery. Washington, D.C., with its neoclassical buildings, was designed to echo the ideals of democracy. But in Hitler's hands, monumental architecture served the opposite purpose. It became a visual argument for dominance, unity, and fear. Speer embraced the opportunity with a fervor that startled even those close to him. The shy lecturer from Berlin transformed almost overnight into a man working at impossible speeds, sketching projects that defied both logic and landscape. And Hitler loved it. Their first major collaboration, the Nuremberg rally grounds, was not merely a venue. It was a manufactured emotion, a space engineered to choreograph MASS psychology. Speer did not design seats. He designed obedience. He did not design walls. He designed echo chambers for ideology. He did not GN lighting. He designed a cathedral of fire where every torch became a sermon. American journalists who later studied those rallies described them as cinematic authoritarianism. They were spectacles in the Hollywood sense, but without heroes, without conflict, without moral escape. Instead, they offered a vision of a single, unified audience. An audience without individuality. Speer's architecture made that illusion feel real. What makes this part of the story human and tragic is that Speer convinced himself he was simply doing his job, a designer building what his client requested, a technician executing instructions, a professional grateful for steady work. This rationalization is painfully common in history. In countless American corporate scandals, war efforts, and political crises, people later claimed they were just following orders. Speer's story shows the danger of that logic when amplified by talent. As Speer's projects grew, grand boulevards, triumphal arches, a reimagined Berlin built to rival ancient Rome, so did his intimacy with power. Hitler invited him to meals, discussed dreams with him, shared visions of a future Reich-shaped in marble and granite. For a young architect who once felt invisible, this attention was intoxicating, and intoxication dulls the senses. It blinds you to the people pushed aside so your structures can rise, the families displaced, the workers coerced, the nation transformed into a stage set. At this point in the documentary, American viewers often ask the same question: did Speer know what he was doing? And the uncomfortable answer is yes. Not always politically, not always morally, but architecturally, emotionally, symbolically, he understood exactly the effect he was creating. He once wrote that architecture should move the masses, and Hitler wanted nothing more than masses that could be moved. Speer gave him the buildings to do it, but even the grandest stone has cracks, and even the most carefully staged spectacle cannot prevent history from shifting beneath it. As war loomed and the world began to fracture, the foundations of Speer's architectural empire trembled. The designs he imagined as eternal would soon meet the reality of bombs, fire, and collapse. And so the question becomes, what happens when the architect of a dictatorship confronts forces that no blueprint can control? We watched the partnership between Hitler and Speer evolve from a professional arrangement into a shared vision, a collaboration where architecture became both stage and weapon. But the story doesn't move forward through commands alone. It moves forward through desire. Because once Speer began building for a monster, something inside him awakened. Something deeper than ideology, more intoxicating than praise. He discovered scale. And scale, once tasted, is a difficult addiction to break. To understand Speer's transformation, we must examine not just the politics of the era, but the psychology of monumental design. Throughout American history, architects like Daniel Burnham and the creators of the world's Columbian Exposition believed scale could inspire civic pride and unity. Their work shaped cities, not armies. But in Speer's world, scale served a different purpose. It wasn't meant to uplift. It was meant to overwhelm. By the mid-1930s, Speer had become the regime's favorite architect precisely because he could think bigger, heavier, taller. Hitler wanted buildings that would challenge the heavens. Speer wanted a CL who would let him. This was not a relationship of morality, it was a relationship of ambition. Standing in his studio late at night, Speer would sketch lines that stretched beyond the edge of the paper. Colleagues recalled him pacing the room, murmuring to himself, visualizing grand avenues, so long they seemed to defy geography. The man who once felt invisible was now designing structures meant to make entire populations feel small. And that is the heart of this chapter. Scale became Speer's language of power. In American documentary tradition, we often explore how individuals justify their actions when they believe they are serving a greater vision. Speer leaned into that narrative. He told those around him that beauty required size, that order required structure, that the future required something unmistakably monumental. He rarely considered who would bear the cost. As he planned the redesign of Berlin, renamed Germania in Regime, fantasies, Speer imagined a city dominated by titanic forms, a great hall capable of holding 180,000 people, avenues so wide They would swallow the human voice. Columns so huge that storms would echo inside. Their hollow cores. American architects visiting. These plans describe them as imperial delusions in stone, a phrase that captured both the grandeur and the peril of Speer's visio. Yet what makes this story painfully human is that Speer felt genuine awe for his own creations. He wrote in his diary that scale freed him, that the immensity of a building allowed him to transcend the limitations of ordinary life. To a man raised in a strict bourgeois household, scale was rebellion. To a man overshadowed by more gifted peers, scale was redemption. To a man serving a dictator, scale, he became a sedative and excuse powerful enough to numb the conscience. And while Speer dreamed in colossal strokes, the machinery behind his designs grew darker. Thousands would be forced into labor to quarry stone, mold concrete, and erect foundations that symbolized not national pride, but domination. The very scale Speer worshipped required human bodies to sustain it. This is Here American cultural memory becomes important. US historians often interrogate the ways power masks itself behind aesthetics. Speer's work offered a perfect case study. His buildings were so massive, so meticulously symmetrical, that they distracted from the suffering woven into their foundations. Beauty became camouflage, scale became absolution. But structures built on myth cannot withstand reality forever. As the world edged toward war, the limits of material, manpower, and time exposed the naivety of Speer's architectural fantasies. The grandiose cracked under their own weight. The marble quarries could not supply enough stone. Nature indifferent, ungovernable, refused to cooperate with Speer's ambition. Slowly, the architect who had once reached for the sky began to feel the ground shifting beneath him, because scale may seduce, but it does not protect. It only delays the moment when consequences arrive. And for Speer, those consequences would come not from a critic or a rival architect, but from the sky itself. In the form of bombs that cared nothing for symmetry or dreams. Gives Part 6 will explore E-Day the walls fell, when Speer's monumental visions collided with the violent reality of war, and the structures meant to last 1,000 years, shattered in a single night. We saw how Albert Speer surrendered to the seduction of scale, how monumental architecture became both his escape and his self-forged identity. But ambition has a limit, and history has a way of pushing back. For every towering column Speer imagined, there was a human cost. For every boulevard widened, there was a family displaced, and for every stone lifted into place, there was a world inching closer to war. Now, the story enters the moment where dreams of permanence collide with the violence of reality. The day Speer's walls began to fall, when the air raid sirens first echoed across German skies, something shifted in the soul of Speer's architecture. These structures designed to demonstrate eternal power were suddenly vulnerable, almost fragile. Bombs are indifferent critics. They do not admire facades or respect symmetry. They do not care how many years a building was meant to last. As Allied planes cross into German airspace, the nation's grand monuments became targets. What Speer had once envisioned as the physical spine of a 1,000-year future became, instead, a map of everything the regime feared losing. American wartime journalists who witnessed the bombing of Berlin described it as the night the earth seemed to exhale fire. Streets glowed red, windows shattered long before flames reached them, and buildings that once projected dominance trembled like exhausted giants. Inside this collapse was a bitter irony. The very scale Speer worshipped now made his structures easier to massive columns caught fire like torches. Wide avenues acted as runways for destruction. Grand arenas, once filled with orchestrated crowds, now echoed with the roar of an enemy he could not outdash. Design. For the first time, Speer confronted a truth no architect wants to face. His buildings were mortal. Witnesses recalled seeing him walk through the ruins after a more-dual raid, stepping over broken stone, touching scorched walls as though he were checking a pulse. His face, they said, looked aged by decades in a single night. He had built these saint structures to defy time, yet time accelerated by war had answered him brutally. In American documentary tradition, this moment represents the collapse not only of architecture, but of ideology. It is the pivot when a grand narrative unravels, when the myth of invincibility meets the undeniable weight of consequence. Speer, who once believed architecture could engineer destiny, now had to compare the truth that destiny does not obey blueprints. As the raids intensified, he was appointed Minister of Armaments, a shift that revealed how deeply the regime trusted his organizational abilities. But this new role placed him at the center of destruction rather than creation, managing repairs, calculating losses, directing labor he could no longer pretend was voluntary. His dire IES from these years betray a quiet desperation. He wrote of sleepless nights, of maps covered in red X's marking destroyed districts, of a gnawing fear that everything he had built was dissolving faster than he could rebuild. Yet even then, he clung to the idea that his architectural legacy had survived the war, if not in stone, then in memory. But memory is a harsher judge. Hon Marble. American historians later argued that the destruction of Speer's buildings shattered more than physical structures. It shattered the illusion that beauty could justify obedience, that grand awe could cleanse guilt, that architecture could stand apart from the crimes it supported. As bomb after bomb fell, the mythology of the regime evaporated. The eternal right proved frighteningly temporary. The walls Speer believed would outlive empires cracked like brittle shells, and in those fractures, a new question emerged. When a world built on lies collapses, what happens to the man who designed its stage? The night the walls fell was not merely the failure of buildings, it was the failure of a worldview. Speer could no longer pretend his work was neutral. He could no longer hide behind the purity of design. He could no longer claim ignorance of the human suffering that lay beneath his stone foundations. The collapse of his architecture marked the beginning of another collapse, the collapse of his self-constructed innocence. We watched the walls of Albert Speer's grand illusions come crashing down, bombs turning his monumental dreams into shattered stone, history refusing to honor the permanence he once believed he could command. But physical destruction was only the beginning. There is a deeper ruin that follows the end of every empire, a quieter collapse that takes place not in cities, but inside the minds of the men who built them. When the war ended, Speer was no longer an architect of power. He became an inmate, and his new world measured only a few meters wide. Spandau Prison, the fortress where the Nazi leadership served their sentences, was not the grand stage Speer had imagined himself standing upon. Its walls were bare, its corridors narrow, its silence oppressive, but perhaps most painfully, there was no scale here, no room for grandeur, no space for spectacle. Only the stark intimacy of reflection. American scholars often emphasize this period as a turning point not only for Speer, but for how 20th century history examines guilt. In the American imagination, prisons are places where characters confront their inner truths. In Western storytelling, the cell becomes a crucible, stripping away illusions. For Speer, this was exactly what imprisonment became. Days were regimented, almost monastic. Inmates tended gardens, scrubbed floors, marched in circles under the watch of for different allied powers. Speer, once orchestrator of colossal structures, now trimmed hedges and polished stair rails, and in the absurd contrast between his former power and his current insignificance, a strange clarity emerged. He began to draw. At first, the sketches were simple: arches, columns, fragments of old blueprints, reconstructed from memory. But the more he drew, the more he realized he was not merely recording structures. He was documenting ghosts. Each line became a reminder of the human lives woven into his designs. Each shadow in the drawing reminded him of the shadows that had passed through his forced labor camps. His pencil slowed. His sketches grew heavier. It was as though he were drafting confess, irons instead of buildings. American historians note something unusual here. Speer's prison drawings were less triumphant than nostalgic, and less nostalgic than mournful. They revealed a man beginning to understand the full magnitude of what he had been part of, not merely a system, not merely a regime, but a machine of suffering he had helped fuel indirectly at first, then knowingly, then inevitably. This was also the first time Speer could no longer hide behind aesthetics. The stone no longer mattered. The beauty no longer mattered. In the cramped geometry of a prison cell, symboli, SM became unavoidable. Fellow inmates, said Speer, often paced in silence after drawing, folding his sketches like letters he did not dare send. He began writing 2 long entries about responsibility, complicity, self-deception. Some passages sounded sincere, others performative, as though he were already imagining how the world would one day read them. In American documentary tradition, this ambiguity is essential. Was Speer truly repentant, or was he drafting a new kind of architecture? One built not of stone, but of narrative, a structure designed to protect his legacy rather than confront it. The answer, historians argue, lies somewhere between guilt and self-preservation. Speer admitted enough to seem honest, but not enough to be transformed. Still, something inside him undeniably shifted. His cell became a place where he could no longer escape the truth. He had built monuments for a monster, and the ruins left behind were his inheritance. Every night, as guards locked the iron door, Speer returned to a question he could not outrun. Was he merely an architect caught in history's current, or was he a collaborator who used beauty to disguise darkness? And in that question, the next chapter of his story begins. When Albert Speer first stepped into Spandau prison, the door did more than close behind him. It reduced his universe into a rectangle of concrete and shadow, a space so small, so brutally ordinary, that it felt like a punishment designed specifically for a man who had spent his life dreaming in colossal volumes. For Samio, any who once read entire cities, this narrow cell carved out a new truth. Scale could no longer protect him. Ambition could no longer shield him. Here, he was no architect, no minister, no chosen confidant of power, just inmate number 5. Human perspective. The transformation was almost surreal. Guards noted how Speer paused before sitting on the thin prison bed, as though expecting it to behave like the marble benches he once commissioned. His hands trembled not from cold, but from the shock of irrelevance. In American documentary storytelling, his moment is what writers call the collapse of character myth, the point at which a powerful figure is stripped of context, title, and grandeur until only the core of the human being remains. Speer had spent years telling himself a story, that he was a technician, not a believer, that he was an artist caught in a political storm, that he was close to evil but not shaped by it. Inside this cell, there was no stage for such narratives, there was only the quiet. And in that quiet, memory becomes loud. Historical context, American lens. For many American observers, especially those who studied the Nuremberg trials, Speer became a symbol of a very specific kind of guilt, the administrative intellectual, the man whose hands were not bloody, but whose blueprints had cleared the paths that violence traveled. In US media of the late 1940s and 1950s, Speer was often contrasted with more openly brutal figures. He wasn't the screaming ideologue or the uniform fanatic. He was the civilized one, the polite one, the one who spoke in measured tones, and that made him more disturbing, because evil that wears a suit is harder to identify. Architecture that KS beautiful is harder to condemn. Speer embodied this uncomfortable paradox. The cellar's a psychological arena. Days in prison followed a rigid schedule. Early wake-ups, silent ales, long work shifts, strictly timed recreation, but the real drama unfolded not in the yard or the corridors. It unfolded in Speer's mind. Every night, he lay on his back staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster as though they were lines on a half-forgotten blueprint. Walls once meant to imprison began to provoke introspection. He thought of the Nuremberg rally grounds, the way torches illuminated the night sky, how crowds moved like a single organism. He thought of the massive stone tribunes, now reduced to rubble. And in those memories, something unsettling stirred. Had he truly been blind? Had he truly not known? Or was he now rewriting his past to survive the judgment of history? Human detail, letters and loneliness. Speer's letters to his family carefully screened by prison guards reveal a man caught between self-pity and awakening. He wrote of longing for fresh air, of shame when gardeners outside the walls waved tea. Oh, him, of the profound loneliness that comes not from isolation but from clarity. His children, who grew up under the shadow of their father's contradictions, wrote back with cautious affection. Their words reminded him of the life he'd built alongside, the life he'd destroyed. This duality, father and functionary, designer and destroyer, haunted him. American cultural analysis. America, and historians often say that Speer's time in prison represented a unique experiment. Could a man confront his own past honestly when deprived of the distractions of power? Could reflection become a form of justice? The answer is complicated. Speer did reflect, but reflection is not the same as accountability. And drawings, no matter how remorseful, cannot rebuild lives lost. Still, his cell became a symbolic space, a crucible, where the architect who once manipulated light and stone was forced to confront the darkness he had shaped. Here, in this narrow room, the myth of Albert Speer finally began to fracture, and from these cracks, the next stage of his reckoning would emerge. Inside Spandau prison, Albert Speer discovered a tool more powerful than brick or stone, the pencil. It became the only instrument capable of bridging the distance between who he had been and who he pretended to become. And in the confined geometry of his cell, drawings transformed from technical exercises into emotional battlegrounds, returned to the architect's mind. At first, Speer drew because it was familiar. Surrounded by bare walls and small routines, sketching offered the comfort of muscle memory. His hands, once used to orchestrating monumental visions, now moved hesitantly over cheap prison paper. He started with fragments, arches, columns, the curvature of a facade. But even these fragments carried weight. A guard later recalled seeing Speer pause midline, his pencil suspended in the air as though he were reliving a memory he wished he could rewrite. Every detail he traced awakened echoes. The sound of marching boots, the glow of torchlit rallies, the roar of crowds choreographed like stone statues come to life. What happens when an architect is forced to rebuild, not cities, but conscience? American documentary lens. American scholars studying Speer's sketches noticed something striking. The drawings were meticulous, but emotionally uneven. Some lines were crisp, controlled, others trembled with uncertainty. This inconsistency, part mastery, part confession, became a hallmark of Speer's prison work. In US documentaries of the post-war era, Speer's sketches were often shown in close-up, each line treated like an artifact. Narrators would point out how carefully he reconstructed the structures he once believed would outlive nations. They would also highlight what was missing: people, workers, victims. Lives. His drawings were always empty. The psychology of absence. In psychology, omissions often reveal more than inclusions. Speer's drawings excluded humanity entirely. as if human presence would contaminate the purity of the lines. But this absence became a mere reflecting the moral void at the center of his architectural philosophy. He had built for crowds, yet drew no faces. He had shaped public spaces, yet drew no public. He had orchestrated mass events, yet drew no participants. This silence on paper matched the silence he cultivated after the war, a selective quiet that left the darkest parts of his past untouched. Writing as a secco, and architecture. Drawing was only one form of self-construction. Speer also began writing letters, memoir notes, personal reflections. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost controlled. Some passages sounded remorseful, acknowledgments of responsibility, questions about his moral blindness. Others felt polished, as though designed for an audience he believed might one day forgive him. In American cultural analysis, this duality became central to the Speer debate. Was he genuinely repentant, or merely performing repentance? Was he confronting his conscience, or constructing a new persona with the tools he understood best: design, symmetry, coherence? Historians began referring to Speer's prison writings as architectural remorse, regret arranged with aesthetic precision, guilt smoothed into narrative order. Even inside a cell, he was building human detail, the prison routine. The monotony of Spandau amplified every emotion. He will wake to the clang of metal, drink watery coffee, and then walk the garden path the prisoners tended. To others, gardening was punishment. To Speer, it was meditation. He clipped hedges with the same attention he once gave to marble surfaces. He planted flowers with the deliberation of someone placing stones on a grand facade. But every beautiful thing he shaped in that garden contrasted painfully with the ugliness of what he had shaped in the world outside. Other inmates noticed how distant he became during these tasks, how he seemed to disappear into an invisible blueprint only he could see. A man rewriting himself, Speer later claimed that prison was where he discovered remorse. But remorse is not a simple emotion. It is a negotiation between memory and identity. Why? And Speer, trained to design structures that guided how crowds behaved, now turned that skill inward, designing a version of himself that history might accept. His drawings softened his edges, his writing sharpened his excuses. Together, they formed a structure more delicate than stone, but far more intentional. A narrative of partial guilt, crafted to preserve dignity without inviting full condemnation. The American viewpoint. To American historians, this narrative was suspicious but compelling. Speer's intelligence made him dangerous. His charm made him persuasive. He understood that the world was hungry for stories of redemption, and he offered one polished enough to attract attention, ambiguous enough to provoke debate. Yet behind every sketch and every sentence lay an uncomfortable truth. Speer was not only documenting his past, he was editing it. And that is why the next stage of his prison journey, the moment where he begins to confront the deeper layers of complicity, matters so profoundly. As the years inside Spandau passed, Albert Speer's carefully crafted narrative, his architectural remorse, his selective honesty, his self-edited past began to fracture, not because he wanted it to, but because the walls around him, the rituals of confinement, and the relentless weight of time made self-deception harder to maintain. The prison as a mirror. Prison doesn't just confine the body, it confronts the mind. Every day was the same footsteps echoing down the corridor, the same clang of metal doors, the same garden loops walked until the gravel was smooth. In that repetition, Speer discovered something he had not expected. His own memory becoming uncooperative. For years, he had told himself a consistent story that he served the regime as an architect, not as an accomplice, that he admired form, not ideology, that he designed spaces, not suffering, but the mind, especially under ISIL. Asian, has a way of replaying the past differently. New angles appeared, gaps widened, rationalizations began to feel brittle. American psychologists studying post-war testimony often highlight this phenomenon. Prolonged isolation erodes the narratives people tell themselves, allowing submerged truths to surface. In Speer's case, those truths rose slowly, painfully, like cracks widening. In an old cathedral wall. Documents arrive, and everything shifts. Sometime in the mid-1950s, Allied officials delivered new files to the prison library. These were records the Nuremberg judges had no seen. Reports on forced labor, transportation logs, testimony from survivors. Speer read them because he had no choice. Books were limited, and boredom was merciless. What he found inside those pages destabilized him. Names of workers transported to construction sites he had supervised. Figures detailing quotas, punishments, deaths, descriptions of conditions he had said as administrative matters. For the first time, the clean lines of his architectural drawings collided with the chaotic brutality of human suffering. He reportedly closed the book, pressed it against his forehead, and whispered something the guard could not hear. Perhaps it was disbelief, perhaps it was grief, perhaps it was the realization that the guilt he had curated so carefully was far too small for the truth now staring back at him. American cultural perspective. In American films and literature, this moment is often portrayed as the moral turn, the point where a character, stripped of illusion, steps into an unfiltered understanding of himself. But Speer's transformation was not cinematic. It was messy, uneven, fragile. He wrote in his notebook, "I should have known," but historians would later underline those words with skepticism. Speer did know. He simply prioritized architecture over ethics, ambition over accountability. Still, this moment in prison marked the beginning of what American scholars call the collapse of plausible deniability. The story Speer had been building for the world and for himself could no longer support its own weight. The human breakpoint. One afternoon, while tending the garden, Speer reportedly dropped his shears and stood motionless. His fellow inmates watched as he stared at a patch of overturned soil, his face pale, his eyes distant. Later, in his diary, he described the moment. "The earth looked like a grave I had not wanted to dig." This was not the poetic remorse of his earlier writings. This was something rawer, a man glimpsing the true scale of his complicity. Speer did not break down publicly, his pride would never allow it. But those around him noticed changes. He walked slower, he spoke less, he stopped defending his past with the same crisp precision as before. In his sketches, shadows grew longer. He drew fewer buildings and more ruins. Walls half standing, columns broken, staircases leading nowhere. It was as though he were finally drawing what he saw inside himself. The great moral question. But here is where the American narrative becomes complicated. Recognition is not redemption. Awareness is not absolution. And Speer, even as he began to confront uncomfortable truths, still had an instinct for self-preservation. His memoir drafts simultaneously acknowledged guilt and protected him from its full magnitude. He admitted complicity in general terms but avoided specifics. He condemned the regime broadly but shielded himself narrowly. This tension between awakening and evasion became the defining feature of his prison years, setting the stage for what comes next. By the end of his sentence, Speer was no longer the man who had entered Spandau with a pencil and a story. The cracks in his narrative had widened, and through those cracks he could no longer avoid the ruins of what he had helped build. But outside the prison walls, something else was waiting. The physical remnants of his architecture now preserved, studied, debated, and feared. They were no longer monuments, they were warnings. When Speer's sentence finally ended, He stepped out of Spandau not as the celebrated architect he once imagined himself to be, nor as the fully redeemed figure he hoped the world would see, but as a man standing between two versions of history. Behind him lay decades of introspection, carefully edited remorse, and the cracks in a story he could no longer completely control. Before him lay the physical remnants of his past monuments, stripped of purpose, stripped of ideology, stripped even of pride. Now, the question was no longer what he had built, but what his buildings had become. Across Germany, the structures Speer once imagined as eternal pillars now stood in fragmented silence. The grandstand at Nuremberg, overgrown with weeds, looked like a skeleton of ambition. The colossal stone blocks, once illuminated by thousands of torches, now absorbed only rainwater and the quiet footsteps of tourists. To many Americans visiting Europe after the war, journalists, veterans, students, these ruins became more than architectural leftovers. They were symbols, reflections of how easily power can disguise itself behind beauty. American documentaries from the 1960s and 70s often lingered on these sites, camera frames holding on cracked stone and crumbling steps, as narrators spoke about the fragility of democracy and the seduction of spectacle. In this new era, Speer's architecture lived a second life, not as propaganda, but as caution. Cultural memory, the American lens. In the US, the concept of preserving dark historical sites evolved into a moral practice. Places like Gettysburg, Alcatraz, and later the 9/11 memorial became landscapes where Americans confronted past wounds. Germany, facing its own depths, approached Speer's structures with a similar sense of duty. Not admiration, not nostalgia, but responsibility. Historians debated whether these sites should be demolished, left to decay, or preserved as educational anchors. Ultimately, many were kept standing not to honor their original purpose, but to ensure that future generations would never forget what had been. All owed to rise. As one American scholar wrote, "A ruin is not an apology, it is an argument." Speer, now an old man walking among these arguments, felt the confrontation in every step. Human detail. Speer among the stones, visitors occasionally recognized him, though fewer and fewer over the years. Some stared, some looked away. Once, a student approached and asked softly, "How does it feel to see this now?" Speer didn't answer. Immediately, he touched the stone, rough and cold, then replied. It lasted longer than the ideas behind it. That is both comforting and terrible. This was Speer's tragedy. His buildings had outlived the regime, but not the consequences. During interviews, he admitted that the ruins unsettled him more than his years in prison. Prison had walls, ruins had echoes. They reminded him not of what he claimed to be, but of what he had enabled. He could shape his narrative on paper, but stone-weathered, cracked, uncooperative too. Load a story he could no longer edit. Historical reflection. American historians often point out that Speer's architecture became the physical equivalent of a moral warning label. They were objects that forced observers to ask difficult questions. What becomes of beauty when it serves brutality? What becomes of design when it becomes complicit? What becomes of an architect when the architecture survives, but the justification does not? In this sense, the ruins did what Speer's drawings and memoirs never could. They confronted the viewer without charm, without narrative, with at excuses. A nation confronts itself. Germany preserved pieces of his work not to honor Speer, but to guide the next generation away from the illusions that once shaped a nation. The stones became teachers, the empty plazas became warnings, the silent stadiums became testimonies to the danger of confusing all with truth. And as visitors, European, American, global, walked these paces, they felt the weight Speer once tried to hide. Architecture is never neutral. Every structure carries the intentions of its maker, and sometimes When history shifts, those intentions are revealed in Ruins. Walking through these remains, one question rises unexpectedly, not about the past, but about the future. If beauty can be used for evil, should it be preserved, destroyed, debated, feared? When Albert Speer returned to the world, after 20 years in Spandau, he stepped into a landscape he no longer recognized yet, one that could not escape him. Germany had rebuilt itself, its cities humming with new industries, modern architecture, and an identity forged in the tension between remembering and moving forward. But the remnants of his designs still stood, scattered, like broken sentences in a story the nation was trying to rewrite. The first time Speer revisited Nuremberg after his release, he walked slowly, almost cautiously, through the remains of the Zeppelin-felled grandstand. The stone blocks, once aligned with military precision, were now cracked, weathered by rain, and softened by Morse. Grass grew through fracture lines, like nature was reclaiming what ideology had stolen. American visitors often describe these ruins as ghost monuments, places where the wine seemed to carry echoes of crowds that no longer existed. For many American soldiers who returned decades later as tourists, the contrast was disorienting. The same place where tens of thousands once marched in lockstep was now quiet enough to hear birdsong. The ruins town. Goethe knew lesson one, that no rally, no speech, no propaganda could have taught in its prime. They testified to impermanence. They exposed the illusion at the heart of totalitarian ambition, the idea that stone can outlast truth. As Speer moved through the debris, he looked less like an architect revisiting a creation and more like a man wandering through the afterlife of his own decisions. Witnesses recalled how he kept his hands behind his back, chin lowered, eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the ground. It was the posture of someone who understood that ever why broken stone was a verdict. American historical lens. In American academic circles, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, these ruins gained symbolic weight. Scholars used them as case studies in university ethics courses, pointing to them as evidence that beauty and moral corruption can coexist uneasily within the same walls. Documentaries aired on PBS showed slow, lingering shots of the structures, often in winter, snow resting on cracked marble, icy wind rattling empty corridors. The absence of human presence became the most powerful presence of all. This visual vocabulary resonated deeply with American audiences. The ruins looked cinematic, but in a way that demanded contemplation other than awe. They were too damaged to inspire admiration, yet too imposing to ignore. Speer's internal geography forced Speer. Walking among these remnants was like traversing a map of his past illusions. Every step through an abandoned parade ground echoed with memory not of victory, but of the moral blindness he once permitted himself. These spaces were designed to orchestrate vast crowds, but now they amplified only silence. And in that silence, Speer faced a truth he could never articulate fully in interviews or memoirs. The architecture had not merely collapsed, the meaning he had assigned to it had evaporated. Beauty had survived, but purpose had not. Stone had endured, but ideology had failed. What remained was a contradiction that refused resolution. The German government, recognizing the educational value of these sites, decided not to demolish them entirely. Instead, they left them partially preserved, an intentional imperfection. A way of saying, this happened, and we will not pretend it didn't. To Speer, this partial preservation was devastating. Full destruction might have allowed him a kind of closure. Full preservation might have allowed him the illusion of legacy. But the ruins broken, why? Yet still standing, reflected the truth he least wanted to see. His work was too dangerous to glorify and too consequential to erase. In the decades after World War II, Germany underwent a profound transformation in how it related to its past. Instead of burying history, the nation made a decision that stunned many American observers. It would keep parts of the Nazi-era architecture visible, not as relics, not as memorials, but as warnings. This decision aligned with the American tradition of historical reckoning. Just as the United States preserved battlefields where brothers fought brothers, or prisons where injustices occurred, Germany preserved remnants of the Third Reich to ensure future generations would never be seduced by similar illusions. The ruins became classrooms with at walls. Every crack was a lesson. Every empty stairway was a question. Visitors, both German and foreign, walked these spaces with an unspoken sense of gravity. American tourists often described the experience as standing inside a cautionary tale. Unlike the polished museums of Washington, D.C., these structures were raw, unrepaired, unresolved. Their incompleteness was their message, the human response. Psychologists studying visitor reactions noted something unique. Ruins evoke a different emotional response than preserved historical sites. Museums tell stories, ruins see. Confront them. Museums interpret. Ruins accuse. Children asked why the stairs were broken. Veterans asked why the stones felt so heavy. Students asked how something so silent could fare so loud. This, too, was part of the warning. The architecture still possessed aesthetic power, the symmetry remained impressive, the proportions commanding, but that beauty now existed inside a moral inversion. Visitors admired the craft while condemning the purpose. It created a tension impossible to resolve cleanly. And in that tension, education happened. The historian's dilemma. American and German scholars debated fiercely. Should architecture tied to evil be allowed to stand? Does preservation risk glorification? Does destruction risk erasure? There were no easy answers, but one truth emerged. Erasing ruins would not erase their meaning, it would erase the questions they force us to ask. By preserving the ruins, Germany chose responsibility over comfort. Speer's legacy in this dialogue. For Speer, who visited some of these sites late in life, the ruins represented a mirror he could not escape. In interviews, he often oscillated between sorrow and defensiveness, acknowledging guilt in abstract terms while avoiding the specifics that would fully incriminate him. But the stones did not abstract. They did not negotiate. They simply existed, indifferent to how Speer wished to be remembered. In one recorded interview, a journalist asked him, "When you see these ruins, what do you think they say?" Speer paused, looked into the distance, and replied, "They say I once believed architecture could outlast everything. I was wrong, a warning for the future." In the American context, these ruins became central to discussions about power, aesthetics, and the responsibilities of creators. They challenged the notion popular in art and academia that beauty can be separated from morality. Because in these ruins, beauty did not redeem. Beauty participated. Beauty enabled. And that is why the ruins stand today, not as monuments, but as arguments, visual reminders that architecture, art, and culture are never neutral. In the end, Speer's ruins remind us that beauty is never innocent simply because it is beautiful. The stones he once shaped to glorify power now stand as witnesses against him, silent, unbroken, undeniable. They teach a truth that echoes far beyond architecture. When art serves cruelty, it becomes part of the cruelty. When design masks oppression, it becomes its accomplice. We inherit these ruins not as monuments, but as moral warnings, proof that brilliance without conscience can lead a civilization into darkness. And so the question remains for us, not for Speer. What will we build? What will we preserve? And will we recognize the moment when beauty begins to betray the humanity it was meant to honor?